Thank you so much. This year, my lecture is dealing with, I think, a presumption that many thinkers and theorists have about how the world should move forward. We take as given that there are certain goods in the world. We think that ethics sets an objective set of rules that we can follow to arrive at these ends. But we have to deal with a stark reality, which is that most of the ideas of universalism, drawn from the Germanic tradition and the Scottish Enlightenment, come about either as a justification for conducting colonial expansion and empire, creating groups of people who are not seen as human, who don't possess this sensibility of good values, or, as Gabriel suggests in his work, as an answer, as a return to escape the rampant and radical identity politics of our time, to come up to an agreed upon order. Now, I'd like to invite us to listen to a great Black philosophical thinker on this issue to contextualize the tension between the values that we assume apply to all humanity and the problem when those values are embodied of people who are outside of the white race. So this is a quick 2-minute clip, but Baldwin says it better than I can.
Where do you stand in relation to the Negro figures in the media we see who frighten us the most, and maybe some of you the most, the ones who want to burn it down, demolish it, the ones who have totally given up? I assume you haven't totally given up.
Well, I'm still alive. There's still breath in me. And so as long as breath is in me, I will never give up. But if you think that Rap Brown, you're referring to Rap really, and Stokely, are something new, I refer you back to an old song. No one even knows who wrote it. Mm-hmm. And it's supposed to be spiritual. It's supposed to be about, Christian church, but it really is a slave revolt song. The man says, if I had my way, little children, great God, if I had my way, I'd tear this building down. It is not new for me. We've always felt that. It is new for you. And if we were white, if we were Irish, if we were Jewish, if we were Poles, if we had, in fact, in your mind, a frame of reference, our heroes would be your heroes too. Nat Turner would be a hero for you instead of a threat. Malcolm X might still be alive. It is that you can face, in some ways, the discontent of white people when they rise, they are heroes. And everyone is very proud of brave little Israel, a state against which I have nothing. I don't want to be misinterpreted. I'm not an anti-Semite. But when the Israelis pick up guns, or the Poles, or the Irish, or any white man in the world says, give me liberty or give me death, the entire white world applauds. When a black man says exactly the same thing, word for word, he is judged a criminal and treated like one, and everything possible is done to make an example of this bad nigger so there won't be any more like him. Now, you can do this if you like, until your party is over. But I know, after all, who my heroes are. And George Washington is not one of my heroes, for example. Neither is Booker T. Washington. What the American public has always tried to do is to accommodate me into a system which is always meant to my death. They want me to become an accomplice to my own murder. That is what you really mean by integration.
Accomplice to your own murder. Throughout history, we have been taught that moral universalism arises as a very specific product of rational debate and discussion. We're often given examples of this. If you're in philosophy 101 classes, the most infamous example is, well, how do you think of enslavement? You are told that you have to have a system of universal values to say that anything is wrong. For the moral realists, they would assert that morals are actually discoverable facts. They're objective things in the world that we could find through rational investigation and observation. And these are generalizable ideas of good and bad that hold across all cultures. The relativist, the cultural moral relativist, starts from an empirical and anthropological basis. he or she suggests that when you look into a culture, that culture creates their own rules for what is right and what is wrong. So that you can't impose a universal or generalizable understanding of values because people's customs, languages, understandings are fundamentally different. And the nihilist, which is very popular today in contemporary movements like Afro-pessimism, suggests that there is nothing that we can call morality as such. Maybe a set of practices, maybe things that we like to address or think of as such, but certainly not something that is truly a morality. Now, Baldwin allows us to see something very, very clearly. He articulates the problem of a value, one that is said to be agreed upon throughout the Western world: equality, liberty, freedom, brotherhood, etc. But when those values or practices are uttered by people who are outside of the West, outside of Europe, who are not allegedly blessed with the light and melanin lacking skin of everyone else, it becomes treason and terror. So we understand then that universal values arise not as an intuitive sensibility of how you think about the world, but rather as an aspiration of how you want the world to look. Said differently, there's never been any empirical substantiation that there are values that everyone in the world holds that are true and generalizable, that are not affected by language and cultural difference. But in times of conflict and disruption, ethicists, philosophers assert that reflective judgments about the world and the failures of democracy can be resolved through universalist proposals such as the Golden Rule or deontological ethics, or dare I say, a more rigid moral realism. So these universal propositions animate ideal perpetrators and victims of atrocities. They imagine that despite the failure of the world, despite the failure of democracy to prevent horror, to stop young people from being slaughtered, young black men slaughtered in the streets of the United States, unable to protect people in Gaza, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. When cosmopolitanism fails and the good wishes of the West don't apply to certain people, philosophers and ethicists assert, well, we need more rigid rules of universal thought. We don't take the error and the failure as information itself. So these assertions then of how one should act are then presented as observable facts. We say, well, we should think this. We should see everybody as a human being. We should value equality. We should have every life, be it black, brown, Muslim, etc., count the same as a white life. But that's not the world that we actually live in. Baldwin invites us to have a reassessment of these universal pretensions that mask themselves as claims and facts. This image by Joseph Wedgwood of the kneeling African is a routine symbol of the kind of warmth of universal values that the West has given to everyone. The kneeling slave. But this idea feeds into the order and the epistemology of the West. That there's a civilization and freedom there. Please, master, can we have some? This is a stark contrast to how people who are actually against slavery and abolitionism actually saw this practice in the world. We didn't see the West just give the freedom that it thought belonged to all of humanity. In fact, Frederick Douglass said in 1856 that it's interesting because you have white abolitionists that hate slavery, but also despise the Negro. So the conflation here is that if you disagree with one aspect that the dominant group feels is fundamentally wrong, like slavery, that it automatically endows the people who are victims of the atrocity with humanity. The rejection of slavery and the brutality doesn't mean that the person or the people that are being suffered and that are suffering because of it are necessarily seen as human beings. These images, Leonard Parkinson, head of a Maroon rebellion in Jamaica, aren't welcomed as expressions of freedom. So just as Baldwin said, Nat Turner would be your hero if you supported freedom and equality, we reject this as a terror and disorder. The same thing with Jean-Jacques Dessalines, liberator of Haiti in the Haitian Revolution that created the first Black Republic of the New World. Where are our universal values and sensibilities there? You see, the question isn't about the value. The question is about who animates the value in the real world. If you destroy the West, if you question democracy, if you dare say threaten white life, somehow liberty, equality, brotherhood don't become values that the world can sustain. So universal values presupposed in this normative wish that we somehow can analyze everyone that is outside of the West, all those people who were not allegedly birthed within the bosom of white civilization, is not only lesser, but judgeable and observable. So universal values then project the kind of ethnocentrism, a Eurocentric bias that says that if the people in the West who are in democratic societies can then judge, welcome, and include people who are not. Now, this idea isn't new. This isn't an anachronistic political reading of how we think of universalism. These are actually thoughts that are embedded fundamentally within the work of the German idealists themselves. Now, in Kant's philosophy of race, I'm sure y'all know Kant's racist. This isn't new. It shouldn't be too controversial. Okay? Immanuel Kant held a view of black people very much drawn from David Hume, who thought they were inferior, thought they were stupid, did not believe that they created any system of morality, ethics, or philosophy or art that can place them within the bosoms of civilization. Now, he did think that they were human, but lesser humans, affected by their geography, whose noses were spread by the iron particles in Africa and whose brains were weighed down by the humidity, which is why our hair is curly. But see, Kant thought that physiognomy, that physiological appearance also talked about a determined moral temperament. So for Kant, and this is contrary to Kleingold, in his last book, Anthropology from a Pragmatic Point of View in 1798, he doesn't talk specifically about race, but he supports the science of physiognomy. Now, physiognomy was a science, it was an art, according to Kant, of judging human beings' way of sensing and thinking according to their visible form. It's the idea, it's the perception, it's the epistemological tool or quality that allows you to look at a person's face and their skin color and their hair texture and understand the moral qualities and where they fit within the rungs of civilization. Now, this isn't unique to Kant. Johann Lavater authored the Essays of Physiognomy in 1778, 2 decades before Kant actually wrote his Anthropology from a Pragmatic View. So this suggests to us that within idealism, you have debates not only about the universalization and ethics that would form a cosmopolitan world, but also the ways that people within the West, within Germany, within the United Kingdom, could look at the people outside of those geographies and assess what their moral qualities are and how they should be treated. This is the history of universal values. Now, we have a tendency to suggest, let's only talk about the good things that these philosophers say. Let's only talk about, isn't it great for us to wish that what I will for myself, I can will for all? That's just rhetorically powerful, isn't it? But then what if I tell you that those people who are your all are the people that look like you, that have the same hair texture as you, the same language as you, that embrace the same arts as you, that want the same aspirations as you do? You see, then our circle of humanity becomes much, much smaller. Lavater said that we should embrace physiognomy because with respect to the form of man, our eyes convinces that the character of the nation, the mind, is visible in the countenance. That the appearance of a person, the appearance of man, because these are ethnologists, so they're looking at men and how the racialized man embodies the perfection of racial characteristics. How these men looked across the world when you go from geography to geography, country to country. And then what that would say for the rest of their people. So these endeavors of German idealism try to motivate a kind of humanism through racial loyalty, a racial idea. Now, this is Houston Chamberlain. No one talks about Houston Chamberlain because he was a Brit that defected to German idealism. So much so that he actually supported Hitlerism and Nazism. Hitler actually mentions him by name in Mein Kampf. The reason I'm quoting him here is because universalism seems like an intuitive and welcoming idea. We're told that it becomes the basis of democratic societies, of a cosmopolitan citizenship, and people walking across the world as if they belong. But were these universal values articulated this way in the midst of conquest and the racial contact that the world had with everyone else? The answer is absolutely not. The application of German idealism, specifically Kant, was founded on the notion of freedom and loyalty, a loyalty to humanity. The idea that if we welcome everyone as a brother, that we can share ideals across space and time. Now, what Chamberlain wanted to say was that, well, look, loyalty is a condition of freedom. When individuals are free, they can do as they please. So what is it that binds them together? If you believe in the golden rule, what makes individuals believe that we should treat others in an altruistic way rather than being self-interested? This was loyalty for Chamberlain. It was an ideal that could only be formulated if you give individuals choice to choose it. So he says, well, look, loyalty does distinguish Toots from other groups, other mongrel races. But what's the differences between the quality of loyalty? Well, look, one finds in almost all purebred races, nowhere more than among Negroes, for example, and I would ask what man could be more faithful than a noble dog? No, in order to reveal the primary source of Germanicism, we must show what is the nature of this Germanic loyalty. And we can only succeed in doing so if we have grasped the fact that freedom is the intellectual basis of the whole Germanic nature. This loyalty and this freedom do not grow one out of the other. They are two manifestations of the same character, which reveals itself to us on one occasion more from intellectual, on another more from the moral side. The Negro and the dog serve their masters, whoever they may be. That is the mortality of the weak, or as Aristotle says, a man who is born to be a slave. The Teuton chooses his master, and his loyalty is therefore loyalty to himself. That is the morality of the man who is born free. So Chamberlain understands that the universal and the Germanic ideal that's pulling people together is an aspiration of the people to see themselves reflected in the souls and the beliefs of the others that they welcome into their kinship group. He says this quite plainly, because if we read Kant, the autonomy of the will is the highest principle of morality. A moral personality exists for him only from the moment when a man is subject to no other laws than those which he gives himself. And according to what principles shall this autonomous personality give itself laws? We must suppose that there's an improvable realm of impulses, certainly only an ideal. An ideal is therefore to determine life. So think about this for a moment. When we talk about moral ideals and ethics, we talk about moral sensibilities and character. What would a virtuous person do under conditions of freedom? So we think, for example, when we have children, if we tell our child that they have to do this thing over and over again because it's the right thing, we don't think the child develops. But if the child chooses for him or herself, oh, well, then we have a great child. We value people who make the choice for themselves. That's the idea behind morality and ethics. So when groups of people, races of people, nations of people make choices about behaviors or actions or types of government, we're evaluating whether or not they're making good choices. But Chamberlain says those good choices are built up in a realm of impulses that are linked to a people, to a race. And certain groups of people are loyal because they're like dogs, like black people. And other groups of people whose loyalties are manifested through freedom and choice are civilized and rational. Now, when people talk to you about universal values, this isn't the history you're going to get. You're going to get the will for all, brotherhood, equality. Everyone should be free and rational. But rationality has exemptions and they have constraints. Now, some would argue, well, Curry, this is just a matter of interpretation, right? We're bogged down by language. Back when I was in grad school, the one analytic philosopher I did like was Quine. It's tough. Analytic philosophers are tough to deal with. They're dry people. But Quine makes an interesting point. He's talking about linguistics, but he makes this point that I think translates to values. He says, listen, when one group of people goes to a different culture, they try to link objects and the appearance of objects to how they think certain ideas are associated with them. So if I walk into a culture and I see a table and these people say the word, a different word every time we see table together, I say, oh, that word means table, for instance. But he points something out. He says, well, look, if an English-speaking person goes to a native community and they see a rabbit, and every time the native community says rabbit, they say gabagai. So the English-speaking person, oh, gabagai means rabbit. But he says, well, look, that's how they think about it because of their cultural schema. You see an object, you associate the object with the word. But what if this other indigenous group says, well, it's not just the rabbit, it's the way the earth moves, the grass flutters, the way the sound embodies rabbitness. You see, there's an incompleteness. If you're into semiotics, what is signified by the word doesn't capture its full meaning, right? So there's a gap there. Well, what if it's the same case for values? What if people outside a group who are not oppressed, have a different history, simply cannot understand the richness or all the meanings associated with terms like freedom, even though they think they share the same idea? See, this becomes the basis of how the modern world and the democratic society imposes itself on people who don't have the ability or more or less the power to assert their own self-determination. If you say, let's get rid of segregation, now you're free and don't address the ideas of inferiority, that's not freedom. If you get rid of apartheid, but you keep everyone in poverty, where the people who stole the wealth of a country still become rich and you still remain poor, that's not freedom. But the universalist says we've eliminated the thing that we've defined and articulated as the barrier to our understanding of freedom, and that thereby becomes the basis for a generalizable understanding of what freedom is and shall be. So it's under these conditions that universalism asserts itself as being generalizable to all, but ignores the error and the failures associated with its problems. This is why we have theorists like Sylvia Wynter, who points this out, who says, listen, we start from the view that the human being constructs values and mediates them. But what if the problem is the human being itself? What if we don't have a shared notion of humanity? What if the human itself is a cultural construction that certain groups of people rationalize and utilize as if they're the basis of everyone else? So like the Copernican revolution, this is a piece that precedes this. She says, look, you can't solve the issue of consciousness and knowledge within their body of knowledge. You just can't. Within the medieval order of knowledge, there was no way in which you explain why certain planets seemed to be moving backwards, because you were coming from a geocentric model. So you had to know the world in that way. Whereas from a man-centric model, we can't solve consciousness because man is a purely ontogenic and biological conception of being, which creates culture. So if we say consciousness is constructed, then we ask, who's doing the constructing? Who constructs these values? See, the anti-humanist makes an intervention into universalist discourse because they're asking a question. They disagree with the presumption that there is simply an agreed upon language, there's agreed upon values, there's agreed upon perspective from which you can view history and pull from it certain ideas that we think are fundamentally true. This is why thinkers like Norman Ajari, a great colleague I have at the University of Edinburgh, suggests that universalism becomes a false strategy of endowing credibility to values and ideas. It's in the particular. It's in how the people who are oppressed, the people who are marginalized, embody or aspire for a new world that gives it credibility and gravitas that pulls us to their ideas of freedom or justice. It's not through the ideas that we develop sitting in a chair. Now, universalists always take the high road. They want to articulate a view of human nature that's fundamentally good, optimistic, and rational. This is the basis of Kant's autonomous and free individual. But what if we took a more pessimistic view? Social dominance theorists and biosocial thinkers have a different view of human nature. They suggest that throughout Western societies, groups, specifically dominant in-groups, create mechanisms that mediate interracial and interethnic conflict and cooperation. Now, Vandenberg suggests that when we talk about human sociality, there are a few things that operate. The first is kinship selection. It's the ability of a group to extend its ideas to other members of groups. So if you're, say, Anglo-Saxon and you want a relationship with Toots, you can draw that relationship by saying that you share an idea. There's the idea of reciprocity, which suggests that people within dominant groups exchange resources, build things from mutual cooperation. But then there's coercion. And the coercion is usually a mechanism of antagonism that's held for people who are in outgroups. Now, Vandenberg suggests that when we look at history, Western society as generally, we see that coercion becomes the basis of ethnic and interracial relationships. And he asks a profound question. He says, well, it's strange because even though we observe this antagonism that people have to people who are outside of their group, not only in terms of how they're understood and what they think, but how we treat them and where we think they belong in hierarchies of civilization and being, we cover that with this appeal to liberty, equality, egalitarianism, and fraternity. So he sees the rhetoric or the pretense of universal normative aspirations, right? These universal values as being a legitimation myth used to cover and bring benevolence to the antagonism they hold to people who are outside of their group. Now, ultimately, I think the answers to universal values is an anti-ethical stance. We've been lured by the romanticism of believing we're all the same. We've had a hard time dealing with difference, much less difference from people who have less power or who are antagonism to what we think of as Western civilization in total. But there are certain beings in the world that are burdened by unrealizable normative aspirations and values. Freedom doesn't benefit you if you're dead. And we have to engage the reality of the situations that confront us not only throughout the 19th century with genocides, but also in our contemporary moment with multiple ethnic and racial conflicts across the world. What if those are not mistakes? The Universalist says those are mistakes in error, those are mistakes in judgments, we could correct them. But that's a long time to have an error, isn't it? A long time for civilizations to move from slavery to Jim Crow to genocide to imperialism to neo. That's a long time to make the same error consistently that seems to benefit the same people century after century, right? So what if we have to think differently about the kind of eschatological burden, or eschatology is a fancy way of saying the moral and ethical limits and consequences of death on our mind? Those become the burdens of our ethical failures. And it's in that particularity that we find reasons to question this shared brotherhood, this shared civilization, this shared notion of the golden rule. Because when you get down to the particular, it means that certain people have to be absent, and certain people who fight for the exact same values, the exact same ideas that the rest of the white world has fought for, will be demonized, condemned, and killed so no one will follow in their footsteps. That becomes the basis of why we can't animate the values that certain groups of people have compared to others. It tends to be the people who are poor, marginalized, and oppressed that don't get the benefits of universal values. Thank you.